To introduce, I'm Claire Ward. I'm the Chief Executive of the ICW, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar today. We're holding this jointly with our members, the CBI, and supported by another of our members, the BSI. We're very fortunate to have such a high quality of membership supporting our institute and our event today. So I'm particularly pleased to have Tom Thackeray, the Director of Infrastructure at the CBI, joining us to talk about how cross-sector collaboration is critical to both government and business ambition to rebuild our economy. And we're particularly pleased that the CBI have joined us today, given their history in the establishment of the ICW over 30 years ago. At the time, CBI, together with the government department DTI, as it was then called, were one of the founders of Partnering Solutions Limited, and which went on to become the ICW. In those 30 years, we've grown to be a self-funded, not-for-profit membership body that has championed the value of structured collaborative working, not just in the UK, but globally. Through our members' endeavours and experiences, we are the thought leaders and have been in much of the development of collaborative working. But we've worked with BSI in creating the first international standard for collaborative working, ISO 44001. Today, many of our members, who are in some cases also members of the CBI, are certified to this high standard for collaborative working and are able to demonstrate across their supply chain the value that they have gained. And 30 years ago, when we were created, there was recognition of the value that comes from cross-sector representation, and ICW remains one of the few institutes which promotes a business discipline that can add benefits to the work and outcome of many different companies in a variety of sectors. This last year has emphasised the need for greater collaboration, not just between companies, but especially so between the public and private sector. If we're to reinvigorate our economy following significant change as a result of both Brexit and the pandemic, we need to embrace new solutions to the way in which we work. We've seen so many good examples in that last year of how successful collaborative working can bring greater benefit to patients, to businesses, and of course to the taxpayer. Given the influence that the CBI has with government, this is a huge opportunity to shift their thinking to how business and public sector can work more collaboratively to achieve a more dynamic economy that can deliver a better standard of life for our population. We've recently established a new special interest group to focus on the changes to public procurement and how we can persuade government of the value of collaborative working as a key component. At CBI, I'm delighted to say, have been very supportive and have taken the joint chair of this group to strengthen the case that we make to government as it develops the framework for public procurement in the future. So before I hand over to Tom to make his presentation, I'd like to thank all of those who are supporting today's webinar and encourage those of you joining us to take part in the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. This is a slightly different format from our normal webinars in that we really do want to have time for engagement with those attending today. So to introduce you to Tom, as I say, is the CBI Director of Infrastructure. He leads the organisation's policy work on infrastructure and energy, aiming to improve business connectivity and ensuring the UK maintains a secure, affordable and low carbon supply of energy. In his time at the CBI, Tom has held a variety of roles, including the CBI's innovation and enterprise teams, covering policy issues relevant to small and medium-sized businesses and the digital and creative industries. He's an experienced advisor to government and has contributed to ministerial groups on research and innovation, cybersecurity and small business. And prior to joining that, I know we worked across public affairs consultancies in Brussels and London. So Tom, thank you very much for your time today, and I'd like to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Claire, and hopefully you can all hear me okay. It's a real pleasure to be with you and with the Institute for Collaborative Working, particularly since the CBI was instrumental in its foundation. That was a little bit before my time 30 years ago, but I have worked across many different disciplines at the CBI, and I think all of them have in common that they sort of benefit from that sort of collaborative aspect of the business community. I'm just going to try and move the slides on if I can. So hopefully some of you on the call have some knowledge of what the CBI is and what we do, but just wanted to give you a bit of a flavour of our background. So we are the UK's largest business representative organisation. We speak for some 190,000 businesses right across the UK. That includes members of our trade association group as well. So together they employ nearly 7 million people, which is around a third of the private sector workforce. So it's small, medium and large businesses right across the UK in all sectors of the economy, which is really important. That's what gives us the strength and power in our voice, in that we are that broad church. I'm the director, as has been said, of infrastructure and energy policy, and I think in my day-to-day is often, or prior to the pandemic certainly, was sort of going in and out of Whitehall and Westminster, talking to politicians, talking to civil servants to try and change the policy environment to enable our companies to invest, to bring prosperity to the UK economy. I think increasingly we're interested in what the CBI can do to play back to our members and to enable them to make changes in their own businesses as well, to be more of a leadership organisation as well as a lobbying organisation. So working with the ICW in those kind of aspects is going to be really interesting and important for us as well. I think obviously our members are a diverse group, but what unites them is that they do see the value in collaboration, and joining a network like the CBI, do have an eye on the value of establishing those partnerships with other businesses, particularly cross-sector. So I think they would be converts to the mission of the ICW as well. My work also focuses in on the relationship between business and the public sector, particularly those businesses that are supplying goods and services in the form of public-private partnerships. And here we've been very active in recent years, doing things like gathering evidence on procurement processes to understand how businesses are finding those processes and playing some of that back to government. We have extensive surveys that we do to inform our thinking there. Particularly post-Carillion, we've been thinking about the sort of nature of collaborative commercial behaviours and making sure that the structural changes that were necessary post the collapse of Carillion were undertaken in the right way. We also collect a wide range of case studies from our membership, particularly in the public-private partnership space, to really exemplify what we think is good practice when it comes to commercial relationships between the public and private sector. We don't just focus on procurement, we're also interested in the sort of contract management elements, and we've done various reports on how that can be undertaken to best effect to drive value for money throughout the commercial life cycle. And I think it's fair to say, in my role, it particularly speaks to the fact that we are interested in the sort of built environment and the sort of construction and infrastructure landscape, and how, particularly in recent years, aspects of risk and financial stability need to be addressed to make sure that those sectors of the economy can play their full part. And I think, as Claire kind of alluded to, now more than ever, we think that our voice is going to be important in influencing the role of government. And we have played a very active role in trying to aggregate the business voice during the pandemic, when there was a need for speed and a need to get views into government as quickly as possible. We've been influential in particularly co-designing some of the support mechanisms that have been apparent in the pandemic, things like the furlough scheme and bounce back loans. I think today I'm going to focus mainly on elements of the recovery, but it is worth noting that given our broad membership, the pandemic continues to hit different aspects of the economy in different ways, and we've got a bit of a two-speed recovery taking place, and we're very cognizant of the fact that parts of our membership still need substantial support to get through the end of the crisis. But we do think that businesses supplying government can play a significant role in the recovery going forward. And I think, the slogan that we've probably all heard too much about in recent years, well, certainly in the last 6 months or so, is around building back better. And it is really the slogan of our times for businesses and for politicians. And I think that's just because we've seen consensus really around the fact that businesses, politicians, social enterprises, charities, there's really no desire for things to revert to the way that they were prior to the pandemic. Actually, if you look at the decade following the financial crisis, it's characterized perhaps pessimistically by, stagnant productivity growth, political fallouts, growth where it has occurred being unevenly distributed across the country. So there's, I think, a sense that if we are sort of looking ahead to life beyond the pandemic, we should make sure that that is focused on doing things better. But that said, building back better means different things to different people. For the government, they tend to focus on the levelling up agenda. They tend to focus on the delivery of the net zero target by 2050. For the CBI, we are focused on probably more on 2030 at the moment, and really making sure that the next decade is one where the UK really re-establishes itself as a major power on the global stage. And we've been looking at what kind of themes, what kind of opportunity areas will be there in different parts of UK's ecosystem. So 6 areas that we think are going to be hugely important for that building back better agenda. Firstly, we agree on the point about decarbonisation. We think that there are big opportunities associated with being among the first movers towards that net zero target, and we should encourage our businesses to act quickly on that in delivery of the net zero target. Secondly, we are sure that we will need to be a world leader on technology and innovation. And that means not just being known for our world-class science base, but also how we embed that science and that learning into economic growth and make sure that it's being adopted by businesses across the economy. Thirdly, there's obviously a need to sort of re-establish ourselves in terms of our trading relationships across the world, both with the EU and beyond it post-Brexit. Fourthly, we agree with the government's notion that there needs to be a levelling up agenda, but I think we need to go a little bit deeper than often that conversation manages to go, in really understanding what are going to be the drivers of productivity at a local level and who holds those levers in terms of policy to enable those changes. Fifthly, I think we need to enable the diversity and skills of the UK's workforce to really come to bear. And I think here we're just cognizant of the fact that we have changing demographics, and we have an aging workforce, but also people coming out of the schools and education system who need to be trained up to best effect to support the economy. And finally, speaking to the resilience of our economy and the pandemic we've just been through, we need to sustain a healthy economy by sustaining the health of our people as well, and making sure that we're resilient to future challenges in that regard. So those kind of 6 themes are going to be a big part of the CBI's agenda going forward. And a lot of those themes are going to be driven by business activities and investment. But also there's going to be a need for collaboration with government, which is why I think I'd like to focus today on a few areas where public-private partnerships are going to be instrumental. Firstly, on public procurement as an enabler of building back better. Secondly, focusing in on construction and infrastructure delivery and how that can promote a fairer economy. And thirdly, looking at how public-private partnerships can help sustain green recovery. So starting with procurement, I think it's often an overlooked lever of public policy. But if you just look at the overall scale of government spending, you can see that it has a huge effect on our ability to recover from the crisis. So, government spending on external goods and services from businesses, charities and social enterprises is around £300 billion a year, and that's £1 in every £3 that the public sector spends. And obviously there's some tangible value inherently delivered through the contracts that these businesses and other bodies are involved in delivering, but we also think there's an inherent value in bringing those different actors together, sharing those experiences and sort of contributing to a sort of higher level of knowledge and understanding of what works. I think, as Claire mentioned in her introduction, COVID has really brought to bear how important collaboration between business and the public sector has been. There's been a huge amount spent, obviously, on vaccines, on ventilators, on PPE, on hospitals. And we've seen businesses really step up to that challenge alongside charities and social enterprises. And we've also seen differences in the way that we work with the public sector as well, particularly operationally, in terms of really embedding social distancing in our ways of working as well, such as in the transport sector. And this has spurred innovation. I think we've seen lots of innovation throughout the crisis, but if you look at the challenge of setting up a Nightingale hospital in just 5 weeks, which is the case with the Royal London Hospital, that has required massive flexibility and massive innovation on both the public and private sector's parts. So there are things that we can learn from in terms of how we've adopted new ways of working in the pandemic. But there are still long-term challenges when it comes to doing procurement effectively, and what areas we need to address if it's going to play a role in that building back better story. Some of those challenges are externally driven, to do with the rules and regulations which govern our procurements, but a lot of them are internally driven. They're to do with skills, they're to do with culture and behaviours. Some of the things that we pick up in our surveys that are the biggest frustrations for members really centre around 3 key areas. Firstly, there is continued frustration around a culture which really drives a race to the bottom on price when it comes to public procurement. And actually businesses think that they can offer much more by focusing on the value that they can add to these markets. Secondly, I think we're not making the most of competition in these markets, and actually complexity, bureaucracy in public sector markets can discourage more businesses, and particularly small businesses, from seeking to offer their services in these markets. And thirdly, there is still a lack of transparency, I think, around how public sector markets are operating, and that has obviously plays its role in eroding trust, and we need to do a better job in terms of performance of external suppliers, but also performance in terms of public services more generally. The good news is that these issues are well known, and we are seeing changes in the procurement policy landscape, which makes some of our members optimistic that cultures are beginning to change. So, for example, when it comes to that race to the bottom on price, we are seeing a lot more interest and a lot more policy work when it comes to embedding social value in public procurement. And I'm sure those on the call will be familiar with the fact that we've now got a new model for social value, and a requirement that at least 10% of the weighting for assessing bids needs to take into account social value factors and new metrics by which we can measure that. So there's growing interest in the public sector on how they can look beyond price and start to consider those value characteristics that really matter to our membership. Secondly, we're seeing some changes in terms of the rules and regulation that govern procurement. We've got the Procurement Green Paper, which was published at the start of the year, which can change rules in terms of competition, transparency and oversight. Some positive moves in terms of the assessment criteria moving from most economically advantageous tender to most advantageous tender. There's been a focus on flexibility and speed when it comes to the procurement process, and generally the new landscape has the opportunity to promote more collaboration and innovation, which is positive. And then finally, there's been a big focus in the last 2 years, I'd say, in the guidance that's available for public procurement authorities and for businesses looking to interact with them through the publication of playbooks. We've had the first and second outsourcing playbooks. We've had the publication of the construction playbook. It's likely that we'll get one on services and on tech in the future. These are really useful guides developed in partnership with industry that are starting, I think, to pay some dividends. So there is a good deal of policy change when it comes to the procurement space, a lot of it going in the right direction. I think I wouldn't be naive enough to say that we're cracking it all. I think the most common comment I think we get from members is that, you know, it's all very well getting this down on paper, but how do we embed this new way of working through a massive public sector which extends beyond central government, obviously. So moving on, focusing on infrastructure and construction, I think again this is an area where we've seen collaboration throughout the pandemic, with construction and infrastructure companies working really closely with the government, particularly in the early part of the pandemic, in enabling sites and projects to continue to open safely throughout. So the things like the sector supported site operating procedures have been really worthwhile and really transformative. As we move into the recovery phase, it's clear that construction can play a massive role in generating demand in the economy. So we know that for every £1 invested in construction activity, that returns an additional £2.92 to the rest of the economy in aggregate demand. And it's clear also that the government thinks that there's a big role for the built environment to play in the levelling up plan and other parts of the economic agenda. So there's an opportunity for businesses in this area to play more of a part, and obviously working with the public sector in the delivery of that plan. When it comes to challenges in infrastructure and construction markets, I think, you know, there's still a bit of a two-speed recovery going on, depending on which part of the sector you operate in. So while infrastructure has seen a bit of a swifter uptick in the recovery phase, still, if you're involved in commercial property or retail space, for example, it's obviously undergoing quite a big structural change in those markets, and it's much harder for businesses to see where to invest in the future. Secondly, you know, there's continued questions around the ability of public sector partners to manage risk effectively, and that's particularly affecting the ability to get large-scale infrastructure projects off the ground. Thirdly, there's sort of operational challenges with the constraints on trade and travel that we've seen, both in the wake of the pandemic, but also in the new ways of working post-Brexit. And the CBI does have plenty of opportunities to explain to at ministerial level what's going on the ground when it comes to ways of working post-Brexit. So if there are challenges that you're facing as a business that you think the CBI could be putting to government on your behalf, we'd be very keen to hear them. And then fourthly, on workforce shortages, I think, you know, we've seen some reduction in capacity, particularly where foreign labour has sort of gone back to their home countries during the pandemic and not returned, and also skills gaps that persist, particularly in disciplines like digital and environmental, which we need to address. And then finally, I think across the sector, construction structure, we see continued frustration around a lack of cross-government collaboration when it comes to the delivery of schemes, where the ownership of the scope and design and delivery can be taken on by one department, but then undermined by policies or budgets of another department. So plenty to work on there. I think, again, you know, there are some moves in a positive direction in terms of the landscape that we're seeing in construction and infrastructure to deliver the Build Back Better agenda we want to see. Firstly, and I've already mentioned it, is the construction playbook, which I think is a really good blueprint for how to collaborate between the public and private sectors on those kind of contracts. Secondly, I think the work of the Construction Leadership Council has been really appreciated by government and really effective during the last 18 months or so. It really has brought together a unified voice for the sector throughout the pandemic, and has many wins to show as a result, including some flexible planning arrangements, flexible opening hours, and the safety guidance that I mentioned previously. And that's no mean feat for a sector that has been characterised by fragmentation in the past. And then finally, I think there's been much greater focus on the investment side of things, and obviously there's been the commitment to new funding arrangements for infrastructure projects through things like the Levelling Up Fund and the Shared Prosperity Funds, but also an understanding that the government has a role in crowding in private investment through things like the establishment of the UK Infrastructure Bank, which is going to be crucial, I think, particularly in that levelling up agenda and also investment in net zero. And then speaking of net zero, final point in terms of the Build Back Better agenda when it comes to public-private partnerships. I think across our membership, whether you engage with the government or not, businesses are overwhelmingly backing the net zero agenda. They're hearing from their customers and their investors that they need to be more sustainable. Many businesses have been impacted by extreme weather events with increasing regularity. So it's really on their doorstep that something needs to change. And more positively, I think more and more businesses are seeing the advantages of moving quickly, establishing new markets by being among the first movers to develop and to adopt climate change technologies. But it does require huge transformation across global supply chains. And we need to move at pace, and particularly this year, given the UK is hosting COP26 in Glasgow in November. To be a credible host, we need to make sure that the government is acting in terms of the policy environment, but also businesses are working on their own operations to become more sustainable. When it comes to procurement, obviously, there's a vast swathe of businesses who are providing solutions for the public sector, whether that's sort of decarbonising the public sector estate, provision of electric vehicles, the rollout of renewables, across the suite. Businesses are involved in that transformation. But I think more broadly, all procurements can help on this agenda, and particularly with the move towards more social value, making sure that there are sustainability metrics involved is going to be a big part of businesses playing their role in public sector markets in the years ahead. And we might see action from government in terms of the qualification criteria that they demand from businesses as well. And we've seen in areas like prompt payment, for example, where they are demanding transparency of a business's payment performance before they consider entering into a commercial relationship with them. I think in the same way we might see more of that criteria established for net zero as well. I can just conclude by saying that businesses I work with every day are seeking to collaborate, whether they're feeding into the policy papers that the CBI is putting together, or whether they're dealing with some of the societal challenges that have been the focus of my presentation. But I think what we've achieved during the pandemic and the coronavirus crisis has shown what is possible when public and private sectors work together. It's often said, let's not waste a good crisis, and there's plenty around the coronavirus that I'm sure we'd like to throw in the bin, but there's plenty, I think, also to take forward into the new way of working. And I think CBI does have this new agenda for 2030. It is optimistic, it is future looking, and I think public-private partnerships is a big part of that Building Back Better story. So thank you for listening this morning. I'm really keen to hear your questions, but also to get your input and your feedback into that mission. So thank you.
Thanks, Tom. That was really insightful. Just want to check you can hear me okay?
I can, yeah.
Perfect. So we're going to turn to the questions we've received from the audience now. We'll start off with a couple that we've had during the registration, but we've also had a few through whilst Tom's been doing his presentation. So what I'll do is I'll call on you and unmute you, and then you can have a conversation with Tom about that question. And if you don't want to type it out in the question box, you can raise your hand, and if we've got time, we'll come to as many people as we can. So the first question we received was, how will you drive effective collaboration across sectors where competitive pressures exist and so many organisations do not understand the difference between cooperation and collaboration? Bit of a long one there for you.
Yeah, I know. I'm happy to take a stab at that. I think, as I said at the start, I think the good news is from a CBI perspective is that when our members have joined the CBI, I think they're sort of entering into that relationship with the collaborative mindset already in place. So perhaps they're approaching it in a more positive and progressive way. I think also the fact that we tend to deal with things that are they're quite a high level that the CBI works on. So we are dealing with big societal questions around how you reach the net zero target, for example. And when those challenges are so enormous, it's almost by design that you need sort of all hands to the pump. And I think a good example of that is, you know, in something like the role that hydrogen technology can play in the economy, for example, is that it's going to be expensive to get it off the ground. You need to make sure that there's lots of use cases for it. So you're going to need to have that collaboration across sectors to deliver the scale that's needed to get a return on that investment. So, you know, we try and create forums which enable that that dialogue to happen at quite an early stage, and then it's taken from there. I think it does get more complicated when you sort of get into the nitty gritty of contracts and partnerships and, you know, actual projects you're going to work together on. And that's probably a level of detail beyond which the CBI is tending to operate. I will just flag up one area of collaboration where it's worked quite well, which is again in the decarbonisation space. We've got we built a new platform called the Goal 13 Impact Platform, which is focused on in-depth interviews with sustainability professionals based on their net zero targets, trying to work out what's been the drivers for their action, but also the impact of that action on their financial performance. And then what that does is create a big aggregate set of data which companies can look through and learn from. So it's that sort of peer-to-peer learning, which we're hoping to facilitate there. So it's a big challenge for us, but hopefully, as I said, you know, those engaging with the CBI are sort of already that way inclined.
That's really interesting, and obviously sort of sharing information as early as possible is just such a key part of collaboration. Next I'm going to come to Bill Taylor. He's asked a couple of questions in the box.
Hi there. Couple of questions for you. First one involves commercial arrangements. One of the challenges I think facing public-private procurement, especially in infrastructure projects, is the use of inappropriate commercial models. Government departments continue to modify standard contract models like NEC and with inappropriate terms and conditions and the apportionment of risk. This drives what we thought to be more collaborative contracts to adversarial models. How can the CBI stop influence CCS in this ridiculous behaviour? And this, as you know, has been the subject of a Public Accounts Committee review. Rupert Soames, I believe, summarised this quite eloquently in that. So, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge. I'm interested to get your thoughts, Bill. But I think, like I said, some of the policy is moving in the right direction. I think the construction playbook is quite explicit in the fact that there shouldn't be that continued modification of the standards. But I guess what we would like to see is that embedded in the actual behaviours and the actual realities of what we're seeing on the ground. I would say, where can the CBI help? Well, I think we are collecting those case studies, and I think we're doing that in terms of highlighting the best practice, but also the bad practice. And we do have a really good relationship with the Cabinet Office, who I guess are playing a bit of a policeman role when it comes to central government departments and agencies of government in particular, in helping to make sure that that's not, in stamping out that bad practice where it happens. I think the biggest challenge that we continue to hear is obviously when that gets down to the local level, and obviously the sphere of influence of the central government department becomes less and less obvious. So, CBI can then potentially be influential in advocating how we get the best training and sort of centres of excellence established to make sure that those, the capability and capacity is driven up across the board and not just at that local level, at that central level.
And certainly we've got a lot of case studies ourselves in the ICW, so we look forward to working with you on that one. And I guess my other question, and I won't hog it, was about PFI handback. We've got a lot of PFIs handing back over the next 10 years. Have you been involved in helping or advising the IPA on a handback and the importance of collaboration, particularly around, to make those handbacks successful? and really the aim of obviously is to get business continuity, but without good relationships between the parties on the handback, it's never going to happen. Have you been part of that discussion, CBI? Have you been doing that?
I don't think we have actually, Bill, and I don't think that'll be by design. I guess it will just be a case that, our agendas will be driven by the weight of members who are asking us to play a role. And if we can play a role usefully then in representing our member interests, then really happy to explore that and how we can do it most effectively. And sometimes, as I said, CBI is a large business organisation. Sometimes if there is a sort of a trade association or a sector-based association which is sort of already fighting that cause, then we won't duplicate that activity, but we'll try and find ways that we can either take that message to a different department of government where perhaps we have better links, or sort of help from a sort of campaigning standpoint by those things in the public realm using our sort of media links and things like that. So if there are ways that we can help, I'm really happy to have a look at that.
We are involved in that. The ICW is involved in that, some of that work. So perhaps we can take that with you as well and help us move that forward. Thanks very much. Thanks, Rebecca. I'll let somebody else have a go.
Thanks, Phil. That was really useful. We've got a couple of other questions come through. One from Paul Greenwood, who's not been able to connect his audio, so I'll ask on his behalf. He has asked, much of the government's change to new methods, collaboration and procurement that are defined in the playbooks depends upon enforcement of the comply or explain dictum. Is there a view of how this will be implemented?
I think I'm going to have to plead ignorance on that one, I'm afraid, Rebecca. I don't.
We are putting you on the spot here, Tom.
No, I don't know that. It's a shame that Paul can't explain the question, because I'd like to know more about it, but I don't know I don't know how to answer that question.
No problem at all. Paul, perhaps if you fill out the survey that will come round on the back of on the end of the webinar or on the follow-up, and you can ask us the question directly with a little bit more information, then we can try and get back to you with a proper answer with that. Next, we've got one from Adrian Miller.
Hi, Tom. My question really is around a bit of research we've done. We published a thought leadership report fairly recently on future insights into collaboration, and probably the major finding was a really strong focus on structured collaboration. Claire used the term in her introduction. I think the good thing is everyone's talking collaboration. The more challenging thing is, so how does that actually work then? And we promote structured collaboration versus the kind of informal, haphazard approach, or the approach that everyone says they do, but how do you prove it? Because it still seems to unravel at the ends. And I guess my question really is, if that is as indicated by our strong research, how can we work together to reinforce that message?
That's a really interesting point. I think, I think I said at the start, so the CBI has I think, historically been known as a lobbying organisation, and I think that's had great influence and great connections with government to be able to achieve that mission. But I think increasingly, and certainly under our new leadership, keen to play a role as a leadership organisation as well, and to help inspire and create best practice in the sort of commercial behaviours and the operations that our members are sort of taking forward in the programs that they have. So in doing that, we have sort of a range of materials that we're creating on our website across different themes, including in this area of public-private partnerships where I'm mostly involved, but also sort of bespoke workshops and new platforms and things like that. So we don't have to cover everything that our members are interested in. We don't have the team, the capacity available to do that, so we need to do that through partnerships. So it sounds like you've done a whole lot of research and thinking around what works in this area, And that'd be something that I'm sure we can explore how we get those messages to broader parts of our membership to make sure that other industries are also taking that on.
Yeah, I guess actually ultimately it is an offer from us to work with you, to should we say leverage what we've done, including of course ultimately the 44,001, but there's a whole set of derivatives from that we can work together on. So yeah, I think we would love to work with you to reinforce that message.
Yeah, we can take that offline. I think there's different models for that. So we've done workshops, we've done sort of website articles. We hold a number of events throughout the year where there's sort of platforms and breakout sessions where there's different options. But it would be good to pick that up.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Tom.
Do you believe collaboration can be truly successful without introducing a systematic, structured approach?
I think this is probably something that colleagues from the ICW are sort of more qualified to answer than me, given the focus of the organisation. But it seems to me the steer that the previous questioner sort of driving towards was that it does require that structure. And there seems to be some research that you've done which suggests that. So I don't know if anyone else wants to come in to provide an angle on that, but it's certainly something I could take on in our messaging as well.
No problem at all. We'll move on to another question from Kevin Tozer. So on the 6 challenges Tom mentioned, point 6 was the lack of cross-government collaboration. Can you describe what this looks like and what's driving it?
I think it has. It looks like different things in different contexts. I think the sort of situation that I was describing is where you might have an initiative of a certain department that just relies on other departments of government for its realization. So something it could be about the rollout of electric vehicles in the economy, for example, where it relies on the manufacturing of electric vehicles, which is a Bayes discipline. It relies on the sort of the planning system and the rollout of electric vehicle charging points, which is the domain of the NHCLG. It's a transport issue, so it's a DFT issue, but it's also a treasury issue in that we need public funding and incentives and the right tax system to incentivize that transition. And I think while there might be a sponsoring department on the elements of that, businesses sometimes struggle to get that collaboration and an overall vision embedded with the government. So I think the fact that the CBI is a sort of cross-sector organisation has links in with all of those different departments. We spend an awful lot of time trying to join up the approaches of those different government departments and trying to get them working together more effectively. But that's often a difficult challenge. So it's one that's a constant thread in a lot of the policy work that we do.
Always ongoing and changing. This kind of links to it, and I think we've sort of already covered it, but how do you believe collaborative working can help the public sector and industry to deliver and improve performance?
I think that's a really big question, but I think goes back to what are the benefits of collaboration in any form. And I think we believe that the sort of incentives and the culture of the private sector, the investment at scale, the innovation that exists within businesses, the sort of the forces of the drive for profit are useful for innovation, and that can be harnessed in the right way, can deliver things for in public sector markets as well. So there's if we want innovation, if we want to deliver things more efficiently and effectively, the public sector can't do it all by itself, and it's going to need to draw on that expertise that comes from outside of government. But obviously, we recognise as well that there's a public good. The public sector has its role to play as well, and has that legitimacy of so the democratic accountability that it has as well. So there's things that can be brought to the party from all elements of that debate, and when those questions get slightly dogmatic is where the CBI is the most worried, and where we feel like we sort of need to play a stronger role in advocating for the role that businesses can play in partnering with government and collaborating. But ultimately, these the strength of the collaboration will be measured on outcomes and and how well the service is performing. And I think one of the things I mentioned in the presentation was actually transparency of performance is going to be really important as well. And I think that's true on outsourced services, but also true on public sector provision. So we need to sort of build up that trust, that public trust in services, by having greater transparency of how well they're performing based on the metrics of what they're setting out to do.
I appreciate I'm putting you on the spot with these ones. We haven't had any foresight of these questions. Right. So we've got another one. How familiar do you think that CBI members are with collaborative working, and how can the ICW support you to inform them further?
So we speak for 190,000 members. So there's obviously going to be a spectrum within that, and members of the ICW will also be members of the CBI. So those on the call who are, I think, will obviously know a great deal. I think what we tend to find is that there is a great appetite from our membership to understand more of this best practice. I think particularly in the small and medium-sized business community, we're thinking about what kind of products that we can create which are more accessible. So yeah, once again, if there's a way that we can sort of learn from the best practice that the ICW is creating and get that onto our platforms, I'd be really keen to explore that in greater detail.
Some greater information sharing with things as well. I think that's probably all of the questions we've got time for now. Thank you so much for staying on to answer those. So I obviously want to say a big thank you to Tom and Claire, and to all of the participants that have given up your time to join us today. We really hope that you found this webinar useful. As I mentioned at the start, we're going to send out a recording of the webinar, which will follow up about a week after this session, and there'll be some supporting resources on that as well, and another opportunity to leave any comments or any questions that you might have that we can give you a bit of a longer response to when we've had a bit more time. We've also got another ICW event on the 13th of May, which I think David and Alan will be sending out some communications about, so hopefully you'll be able to join us for that too. Thanks and goodbye.
Thank you.